Hey guys, so welcome to this video lecture on the next part of our biotechnology class, which is how biotechnologists and scientists and us, how we all sort of get inspiration from nature to do the work that we do in biotechnology. So we're going to walk through that, and we'll walk through some important definitions and ideas. So it's a really good idea to have some notebook paper out and take some pretty thorough notes here. Let's go ahead and get started. So really what this is about is how this idea of nature gives us ideas. So what I want you to do to start this lecture is consider this question. When you think of nature, what comes to mind? And it's a good idea here to pause the video and really consider this and maybe even jot down an idea. And now that you have an idea jotted down of what you think nature is, which can be, different to all sorts of people, I want to walk you through some examples for me and maybe also some questions I think that come from it. This is just an image of the entire Earth, as you guys can see cited down below there. This comes from NASA. When I think of nature, I sort of think of the entire planet, and I also think of, the interactions, the incredibly complex interactions that happen on it and in it. It's absolutely incredible, giant, living, breathing thing. And anything that exists here is, to me, sort of natural. And this is where biologists do our work, because biology is the study of life and how living things work. And as of now, this is the only place we know where it exists. So when I think of things that are natural, I think of the planet. But we could even zoom in a little bit, right? And this is a picture from a tropical rainforest. We can ask questions when we're in nature, like, what is this stuff that's around us? How does it work? How do we reduce it down to and break it apart and analyze it and figure out how to put it back together again and how the pieces interact with each other? How does this stuff work? Where did it come from? What are its origins? How did it get here? And where is it going? How is it going to change in the future? These are all questions that we can ask if we're biologists about nature around us, which is why I think biology is such an incredibly exciting topic. It's so complex, and there's so many great questions that we can ask, right? We love the natural world because we find some inspiration in it. That's where we find our work, is in the natural world. And fundamentally, I think what we're trying to do is really do two things. Number one, we're trying to understand the natural world, right? So by asking questions and analyzing it and breaking it down and trying to put it back together and rearrange it, we're trying to understand how it works. And at our most basic level, that's what we're doing. Second, what we can do is, once we learn something about this complex system, once we learn something about the world, we can use it to improve the lives of Earth's inhabitants, everybody, every living thing. And that's more of an application, right? So number one here, understanding it is really something called basic research, right? And number two is something called applied research. You're using it to solve problems. So first we have to understand something, and then once we understand something, we can apply it and create something new. Or the way that I like to think of it is, if you're playing an instrument, you really have to learn the basics, the fundamentals of that instrument. How does it work? Before we can go off and play jazz, we have to learn how to play the basics. We have to understand how this thing works. And this is the same thing here, right? Eventually what we want to do in things like biotechnology is we want to play some jazz because we want to solve some problems in the world. There's many, many, many different areas. So when I say biology, just look at some of these areas that exist of study, right? So biology is a very, very broad term, and we want to focus it down a little bit. Look at all these different categories. There's cell biology and cancer biology and immunology and genomics and genetics and structural biology. There's infectious diseases, which of course is in the news right now. There's all of these areas that biology encompasses because there's so many broad different types of life, like you guys shared in the animal senses gallery. There's so many different types of things, right? So we want to focus this down a little bit, and we want to focus just into the biology for our class, which is still pretty broad. What we're really interested in looking at in Biotech 1 is biological code. And biological code, we can just think of this as some nonsense that actually codes for something that does make sense, right? So DNA is really biological code. RNA is biological code, the nucleic acids. And we give those that DNA the name genes. And genes are responsible for a lot of really cool stuff. So they also give us some inspiration. They come from nature. Just some examples that I wrote down here is the smell and taste of bananas, colors and pigments that you see all around you. Diseases are oftentimes caused by genes. Cures for those diseases can be used with genes, right? So in our class, what we're really specifically looking at, the fundamental unit we're interested in is genes. And what do they do? So I want to provide you with an example. And remember, I started class with telling you about a great memory that I have from being a kid with fireflies, right? Well, this is a firefly. This is what they look like. What I wanted to mention about this is just look at what they do, right? If you're in nature and you're inspired by this, the question, and like the question I told you that kind of started my journey was, how does this work? I don't understand how this amazing trait happens. And you guys looked at some amazing traits in the animal senses gallery. It's incredible when you look at nature, some of the things that have happened and the things that have developed over time, isn't it? Like that a living thing can actually blink and light up like this. How does that work? So in biotechnology, what we like to do is deconstruct that a little bit, right? I want to figure out how this thing works. And when you get down into the nitty-gritty details, you get this thing, which looks more complex. It looks pretty complex. It is. But on the left, what you have here is something called a protein. And that protein has the name luciferase, which you guys can see right here. This says firefly luciferase. And the way this works is if you get this little chemical, right, that fireflies have called luciferin, which just kind of looks like this, and you combine that with a little bit of ATP, a high energy molecule, and you combine that with oxygen, and then you get luciferase to help do that chemistry. They're like little chemists, right? These things like luciferase. What you get is you get this product kind of as a waste product and all this stuff over here, but as a byproduct of that, you also get light. So really we see this amazing complexity, this amazing trait that's ultimately because of a protein. It's because of a little chemist doing a job that we see when we break it down and we really try to understand it. It's because a protein is doing this and it's giving off some light, and we call that a trait that we can see, and it's what we experience in nature. It's what we're inspired by, but ultimately caused by this protein. But if you dig down even a level deeper, like, well, how does this protein get here? Ultimately, it's coded for by this. This is our code that we're talking about. This is biological code. Right? It almost looks similar to something like computer code with zeros and ones, but instead of zeros and ones, we have A's and C's and T's and G's, and they're arranged in a very specific pattern that looks like nonsense to us. And one of the things we'll learn is, how do we read this? But what you're looking at on the screen right now is the biological code for luciferase. So fireflies have this gene, right? So what's fascinating is these things kind of tie together. We can find some inspiration in nature by looking at a trait that could be caused by just a single protein. It could also be multiple proteins. It could also be the environment interacting with proteins. But the basic idea I want now is that when we get traits, they're because of proteins, and those proteins are ultimately because of genes. They're encoded by DNA. Right? And let's actually cancel out that word trait, and I want to use a new word, and let's use this word phenotype, which should be a reminder from your general biology courses, right? So we want to say phenotype are ultimately because of proteins, and those proteins are caused because of genes. And just to give you a definition of what a phenotype is, in biology, the genotype is the genetic makeup of an organism. It is the genetic code. It's the A's, C's, T's, and G's. It's the genes. The phenotype is how genetic and environmental influences come together to create an organism's outward physical appearance and behavior. They're responsible for the trait, right? That's the phenotype. So when we use the word phenotype, we're talking about traits, right? So here in this firefly example, our phenotype, that the thing that we get inspired by, the thing that we can see, is the lighting up of a firefly. That's an amazing phenotype. What if we wanted something else to have that phenotype? Well, we'd have to know about the protein, and that protein is called luciferase. That's the thing that's actually responsible for the phenomenon. It's the little chemist that does that chemistry that we can't do without. But ultimately, that's encoded for by a gene, and this gene, fireflies have. And when this code is present in an organism, it can make this protein, which can give you that phenotype. So ultimately, what we're really interested in doing is looking at genes for inspiration, right? That's ultimately what we're doing. So when we look at everything on the planet, when we are inspired by nature, one thing that we like to do in biotechnology is understand that there must be a underlying condition that allows these phenomena to occur in living things. And that's why we like to look at genes, right? Think of all the amazing variety that you could have on this planet when you have something like natural selection and 3.8 billion years giving you all this amazing diversity, all this time to work on genes, right? And all this pressure. Just in case that, I mean, that number doesn't make sense to us, but here it is written out, right? 3.8 billion, 3,800 million years. That's incredible amounts of time to get all sorts of diversity from a single ancestor. This shows you all of the branch of life. So 3.8 billion years ago, we start right here with one little weird organism, one weird little cell. And from there, look at all this incredible diversity we have and all these incredible traits. Look at all this stuff that we have to be inspired by that has all sorts of different genes and phenotypes that we can look at. That's what we're excited about in biotechnology. And you guys even provided some of these examples, from glowing turtles, bioluminescent turtles, all the way to things like pistol shrimp and cuttlefish, right? And chameleons and weird sharks. And like, look at all of this incredible diversity and all these incredible phenotypes. Underlying them in the mystery of the phenotype is the protein in the gene. And the protein in the gene is where we like to spend our time. But we're inspired by the phenotypes that we can see around us. Just to give you guys also an idea of the things that we talk about in biotechnology, because remember, that's the ultimate question we're trying to answer this week is, what is biotechnology? I gave you guys this exercise last week, and I asked you to break apart into these 7 departments. Where would your emphasis be? Right? Like, where would you guys give the money? So this is the average budget priorities from Biotech 1, and it's fairly evenly distributed after we get our averages here, which isn't super surprising. What I want to show you is, where does most of this R&D funding actually go? Well, here you go, right? So most of our R&D funding, check this out, actually goes into the health sector, right? And what I want to spend this first term with is talking about health. I want to talk about human health and how biotechnology interacts with that. The NIH alone, just alone on manipulating DNA. Talk about inspiration. We're spend $1.5 billion a year just on manipulating DNA. Look at the comparison there. Lots of money is spent in the health sector. So we've got amazing things. We've got a lot of good that comes from looking at phenotypes, right? So we've got cheese that we talked about and human insulin, and we are able to digest milk, which allows us to increase our nutrition. We've got things like glowing pigs, because we can take genes that code for a green fluorescent protein that then gives them the phenotype of being able to glow. We've got silk that's being made from a gene from spiders that can be turned into clothes. We can look at the development of cells and see where certain proteins are going, because we can trace them with glowing proteins. We can use proteins that digest plastics so that we can get rid of bottles in the ocean. There's a lot of good. There's a lot of problems that are being solved by finding inspiration in nature. But what I want to focus on right now is, what about when things go wrong? What about when phenotypes are broken? How do we fix those problems? And that's the tone that we really want to set for the first part of our studies. We're going to get to the good, but first I want to talk about the bad and broken phenotypes. So for your next assignment, that is ultimately the question. What about when things go bad? How could we wield the same inspiration and the same power that creates new things to help those in need? And specifically, what we're going to be looking at here soon is human diseases and conditions. So you guys can read your task there. It's right here on Canvas. What I'd like you to do is find an article about how human health and conditions are being helped by biotechnology. Let's see what's out there and do a little bit of research. Okay, that's your next assignment, guys. That's what you should be doing today. Find a really cool article, post it, and then read a couple other people's articles and comment on theirs what you got from it. Okay, I also provided a couple of websites where you could find some really cool articles if you're struggling. Thanks, guys. I hope you have a great day, and I can't wait to see you in class.